Judaism 101, meaning fundamental aspects of our tradition, mostly on the inner life moral side, about 10 minutes every week. And then I'll go on to my larger teaching for today, which is the idea of the building and cleansing of the inner temple. They're both connected. What I want to talk about today is something I'll be talking about for quite a while, because the idea that I want to share to you today, in my mind, for we who participate in our democracy, and ideally every citizen who participates in the democracy has some kind of moral point of view, has some way for understanding why we have a society, how a society is founded, what the proper goals of a society are. Most people are not very philosophic about it. They tend to look at what other people think, how other people vote, what they think is best, what they think is worse, and vote in that way, then probably not pay too much attention to it till the next time around. But I think that every society requires some number of people who understand at a deeper philosophic level what's going on and what's at stake. So I want to share with you my philosophic level. I'm going to make a key case for it, both in my Tuesday night class, maybe an entire class next time around, and certainly on Shabbatot. It sounds like a very arcane idea that I'm going to share with you, but I hope to share with you just a little bit of why it is so important, what this idea is against, and then continue it for a few weeks. The idea is called natural law theory. Natural law theory. If you look that up, you're going to see that the greatest exponent of this is going to be Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic theologian. Although Aquinas rests on a long history of Jewish theologians, Jewish jurists, Islamic legal philosophers, all the way back to Aristotle and Plato. So Aquinas is resting on a great mountain of work on this idea. And the idea is this, that human law stands under a higher law according to which it is assessed. So, for example, if you can say, yes, I know that's the law, but is it just? What you're saying is the law on the books don't determine what is just. The law on the books is what we human beings came up with. The law on the books have to accord with something higher. Now the question is, what is that higher? Now, once you move into the religious tradition, people say, well, it's God. Of course, then you have the pushback against natural law that says it's completely tied in with the idea of God. I actually don't think so. In fact, most people that I know who call themselves atheists, who call themselves non-religious, when we take religion and religiosity and God out of the picture, can they still reasonably answer the question, I know that's the law, but is it just? I know that's the law, but is it the best law for accomplishing this good? I know that's the law, but does that law actually help create a good society? Now you notice that the so-called law on the books and the legal system based on the law on the books, which is by legal scholars called the positive law, which means it's been posited in history. That's all we have. We don't have morality deposited into the text. We don't have the idea of the rational good for all society. We don't have the utilitarian greatest good for the greatest number. None of that's written down. What you have are the legal text and the way to deal with the legal text. That's called positive law. And positive law theorists say we should only be dealing with positive law. The natural law people come back and say, you can only deal with positive law if we've already agreed that the positive law is basically just and can self-correct. So how does Judaism understand these two? So clearly, I'm a natural law thinker when I was introduced to the term. Natural law, by the way, is not law of nature. That sometimes means the law of the jungle, survival of the fittest, etc. Natural law means something like this. In the nature of something, by our human nature, things are right and wrong, morally better and worse. And because in the nature of things, there is right and wrong, morally better and worse, then we ought to make sure that what is right and wrong, morally better and worse, is reflected as well as possible in our legal system. So what is this working against? I think ever since high school, people talk about the greatest good for the greatest number. You've heard this. when I was instructor of Holocaust at USC for many years, the students would come in and I would start by saying, well, when we study Holocaust, we're studying a moral issue. We're talking about a great human wrong. And then I would ask the students, can anybody define what we mean by a moral issue, what morality is, what moral law was broken? To a person, the students described ethics, right and wrong, as the greatest good for the greatest number, as if it was in the air, as if it was in the water. They never took a class on utilitarianism. They never thought about these things, but this comes straight out of the work of John Stuart Mill and Jerry Bentham, the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, why did the utilitarians decide that what was right and wrong was the greatest good for the greatest number? Because of their rejection of natural law. They said, well, this idea that there's a conscience behind the law, there's a moral foundation to the law that's not empirical, not based in human beings, is a kind of a religious superstition. So that they said we don't need this idea of a divine consciousness or anything beyond the human being to establish what is right and wrong. And then our job as human beings is to discern it through the conscience and then use our reasoning to be able to bring it into life. They said we don't need any of that. We just have to figure out what the greatest good for the greatest number is. Now, let's try to imagine that. So who determines the greatest good for the greatest number? So the utilitarians came back and said, okay, we don't poll everybody because there are some bad people out there and there's some non-thoughtful people out there. So if you look in their book, they say, okay, just the elites, which probably meant them and their friends. But I say to myself, okay, let's say the elites in America get to decide the greatest good. Well, who are they? Are we going to poll every professor in America? Well, there are some professors in America. What they think the greatest good is actually, I think, pretty close to the greatest evil. So now, how do I know when I look at what, let's say, professors in America think, and here I am a citizen, and they show me what they came up with, I'll say, well, that's actually quite horrible. Well, who am I? In this system, I've already deferred my moral judgment to so-called experts, people with a PhD, and there's something very strongly in me that does not trust experts. In this sense, I'm one of those who more or less says, let's try to understand the consent of the governed and not point an elite in charge of us to tell us what the greatest good is. You can see all the problems here. So from my perspective, no matter what the elites say to me the greatest good is, I don't have to accept it. I don't even believe it. So now I'm back to assessing what the elites say by my own sense of conscience, conscientia, knowing with God, as it were, or knowing with this higher form, that I have a sense of what is morally and better or worse by my human nature, because I am a human being. Now, does Judaism, I'll end here, does Judaism have a natural law theory? Well, the Orthodox really don't like this idea because they think the law, all that you need of the law, is already published in the Torah. Why would God have both the law and a natural law? So implying that there's a natural law means there's a law above the Torah. And then the rabbi said, how do we get at that? That's impossible and not likely true. Everything we need is in the 5 books of Moses and then interpreting the 5 books of Moses. But the Torah itself does not accept that idea. The most famous case, I know Rabbi Manning is chomping at the bit, I'll go ahead and say it. The greatest case for natural law in the Torah, there are many, by the way, dozens. The greatest case is in Torah portion Pinchas, where there's already established laws of inheritance, men bequeathing to sons, the different tribes. It's a complex question. Just go over to the book of Numbers, chapter 27. Take a look there. The daughters of Zelophehad come to Moses and say, this isn't fair. There's something in the Torah that really is not fair. Now think about it for a moment. It's the law, but it's not just. This is a classic question that people ask of in natural law theory. Yes, I know it's the law, but is it just? The minute you say that, you're implying natural law. So they take their question to Moses, and they say, let's look at this inheritance law. We know it's the law, but we don't believe it is just. Moses, says, you might be right here. Who am I? He takes it to God. So Moses takes the question of the daughters of Zelophehad to God. You'll see all this in the book of Numbers, chapter 27. And God says, Ken dovrot benot Zelophehad. Properly do the daughters of Zelophehad speak. There is a moral inaccuracy in the Torah. There's a clause that does not meet the standards of justice. And therefore, God changes the Torah, commands Moses to give a new law because the daughters of Zelophehad have been able to find a flaw in Torah because it does not seem to be fair. Now think about that. First of all, who would put that story in? Who would put in the story of the daughters of Zelophehad who point out that there's a flaw in the Torah? They come to Moses, Moses takes it to God, and God says they're right. The midrash on this is extraordinary because how does God feel about the daughters of Zelophehad finding a flaw in the Torah? God is ecstatic. Praise be the people that produce such daughters. Ashrei, this is something that is praiseworthy and beautiful. So God's state of mind is someone has made my law better. So sometimes as a trick quiz, we say, how many people wrote the Torah? Well, Moshe, we know that. Joshua at the very end, because he buried Moshe, so we have Moshe and Joshua, and the 5 daughters of Zelophehad. So 5 people wrote the Torah. Moshe, the 5 daughters of Zelophehad, Joshua at the end. So that's evidence. And I want to bring a lot more, that what is law does not mean what is just, okay? Because there is, as it were, a higher law, we call the moral law. And the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number sounds good, but the minute you take a peek at it, the sandcastle, the house of cards crumbles, the sandcastle crumbles, because just the idea that we can poll everybody on my street, what is the greatest good, and then have them vote, let's say, 51%, they've decided what is right. They come to the rest of the people on my street and they say, well, we've decided. I can still say, well, you decided wrong. I'm not going along. Now we have a civil war in our hands. So the idea that the greatest good for the greatest number is decided by taking a poll or by turning it over to the elites. If you think about it, now just think about this large scale. The idea that we can ever discern, know what the greatest good for the greatest number is actually preposterous. It sounds good. It's a preposterous idea that we would ever know what the greatest good for the greatest number is in the world, in North America, in a given state. It's a nice sounding idea that I don't think has any substance. And I say this out of great respect for John Stuart Mill and Jerry Bentham. And, the latest articulation of utilitarian theory is Sam Harris and his Moral Landscape, which I read with interest. And, he's a person who's taken that theme and wrote a book in 2011. I was great because I thought, wow, someone is actually reintroducing the great moral debate into popular culture. I thought it was a fantastic thing. But his book suffered from the weaknesses in all other utilitarian theory is, first of all, discovering what the greatest good for the greatest number is, which I think is personally a preposterous idea. And secondly, if I discover it, am I obligated? Which means if we have a finite group of people, my 5 closest neighbors, and they decide, and they say, Finley, hey, we've decided the greatest good for the greatest numbers. I say, yeah, but do I have to do it? Are you going to make me? All right. See, now we're at another area, which is, am I morally obligated to do what my neighbors think I should do, even if I don't want to? There has to be some other moral law, which means you have to obey the laws of society. Well, that's something that the utilitarians didn't say. They didn't say, when you come up with it, now you have a moral obligation to obey it. See, that's the part they forget. So you're going to see why this is so important. Because the idea of, I'll promise to end here, the idea of natural law presumes that there actually are better and worse answers to moral questions, number one. Number two, they're rooted in axioms. For example, human dignity, human rights, sacredness of life that we can enumerate. And one talks about them with reason. core part of natural law thinking is the human capacity to reason about the law. You think about those three things, and then you look at what goes on in college campuses. You look at what goes on in the United Nations. I mean, is there an attention to the basic axioms of the moral law? Is there attention to actual historical facts? Is there reasoning that proceeds through? From what I look, and there are many places in the world, and it is not good for us. I mean, at this moment in history, it's not good for Israel, not good for the Jews. But as many people have said, we Jews are the canaries in the coal mine. Once you go after the Jews, right, who's next? Because if you look at history, everybody's next. So I think we have to dig in and fight against these forces in the world that don't believe that there's something called the moral law. We have to discover the axioms of the moral law, and then how to reason about it and make a case. The problem is, if you try to make a case nowadays, you get shouted down, and that's something that we have to address. And I really want everybody, whoever listens to me, comes to Or HaTorah, understands this as a Jewish idea, as a Western religious idea, as a Western philosophic idea, and I think the buttress of our democratic system that I truly believe is a God-inspired idea.